Have you ever felt lost or disconnected, or like everything you once believed in just kind of turned upside down? If so, and maybe you're feeling this way right now, you could have gone through something, or maybe you are going through something that's known as a dark night of the soul. Okay. And in this video today, I really want us to talk about what the dark night of the soul is, why it's so difficult, and why we go through this. Okay. And also how to work through it as well. Because for me personally, in my own experience, I think the dark night of the soul, even though at that point in time it didn't seem like it, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. Okay. And I think really, if you use a metaphor, it's kind of like a phoenix rising from the ashes, right? It's really kind of that rebirth. And if I could describe it in one sentence, okay, it would really be coming back home to ourselves. So again, if we kind of simplify this, right, the dark night of the soul is really when a person experiences a situation that's so intense and it just kind of disrupts their core sense of self, right? Maybe their identity. There's so many different things that can really come from this, but it's a very difficult experience that can kind of make you hit rock bottom. That's really what happened to me. That's how I kind of like to explain it. I think rock bottom for a lot of people really resonates, right? It's kind of that, you don't know what to do anymore, right? For a lot of people, it's loss of meaning. You start really asking these bigger existential questions, as an example, okay, really depending on what circumstance you're going through. And the thing about the dark night is it's going to be a subjective experience for everyone, okay? There are many different things that can trigger this, okay? We'll talk about more specific examples later, but it could be, as an example, the end of a relationship. Maybe you got laid off from a 20-year career, as an example. Maybe you're going through a difficult time because you've lost a child or something along those lines, right? This is what I'm talking about. It's situations that kind of just push your back against the wall, and you start questioning everything. You don't know what to do with yourself. Sometimes you don't even know who you are anymore, right? It challenges kind of that core sense of identity and just everything about yourself, and sometimes everything about what you believe about the world. So many different things. And also, the other thing that I wanted to talk about as well is sometimes, people talk about this as, the dark night of the soul is kind of like the death of the old self, right? A term that's really associated with this often is ego death, okay? Now, for me personally, I don't really like the term ego death or like transcending the ego. I know a lot of spiritual teachers, talk about, transcending the ego and, killing your ego, if you will. Maybe that's a symbolic term, a symbolic meaning. But for me, the way I kind of look at it, right, is kind of what we talked about before. It's a rebirth, okay? It's kind of like when a snake sheds its skin. This is what a real dark night of the soul is for me, right? Because for me, it's not about killing your ego. It's about building a healthier ego, right? A healthier sense of self, and bringing true meaning to your life and making sure that you are living authentically in how you're supposed to be living your life. And the other thing to remember about the dark night of the soul as well, that's very important, is that it's not always tied to a specific event, okay? So in my personal experience, I didn't even know what caused my dark night of the soul. All I knew was that I was feeling disconnected from myself. I was feeling empty, right? I was feeling like I had no meaning, like life had no meaning, right? All these different things, but those were things that were accumulating over time. It wasn't just a specific event. So sometimes it's a buildup over many years, and then you finally get to this point where you're like, I need help, or like I'm hitting rock bottom, or all these different things, right? So that's one thing to consider. And another question that comes up a lot is, how long is the dark night of the soul, right? And that's a question, again, that, if I'm being honest, I can't answer, because that will be different for each individual, right? For me personally, my dark night lasted a few years, okay? For other people, the dark night can be a few months, okay? Or a year or 2 years. It really depends, okay? And the other thing as well to remember about the dark night of the soul is that it can happen multiple times in your life. It's not just one thing that happens, okay? So maybe in your 20s, something happened and, you were challenged to shed a layer of yourself, okay? So this is, one thing that can happen. But then again, in your 30s, you may be presented with something else that's extremely challenging, okay? And then in your 50s, maybe something else happens again. So this is what I'm saying, okay? There's multiple, layers to the dark night of the soul, and it can happen many times in our lifetimes. But the thing about the dark night of the soul is, I think every time is a transformation, okay? And the first time you go through it is typically the hardest. And then the second time you kind of get this awareness, right? You kind of get this awareness, okay, like something's happening, okay? Maybe it's time for me to shed something, old beliefs, old narratives, old stories that I've been holding on to, as an example, right? To create better space in my life. And I think this is what it is. This is why I'm saying I think a lot of people, or, myself personally, I don't like the term ego death, is because I think that your ego doesn't disappear. It it evolves, okay? Your ego represents, kind of your constructed sense of identity, right? So how we define ourselves, how we interact with the world, and just how we understand our place in it, I guess is another way to put it as well. This includes so many things, our beliefs, our roles, our desires, right? So many different things. So this is why I'm saying I really don't think that we are, killing your ego. I think it's, like I said earlier, I think your ego is evolving, right? I think your ego is evolving and it's building a healthier ego, right? So it's building a healthier sense of self. And if you're watching this video right now and you're like, wow, this really resonates, or like maybe I am going through a dark night of the soul, right? Common symptoms that we kind of feel when we're going through this dark night of the soul, from myself personally, from clients I've worked with, and even just check the internet as well, right? You'll notice that there's a pattern, but a lot of times it's a loss of meaning in your life. It's, feeling disconnected from yourself. It's feeling numb, right? It's feeling very numb. And I would also say kind of like feelings of depression. And I'm not necessarily talking about clinical depression here, but I'm talking about, just feeling lethargic, low energy, isolating yourself, all these different things, right? And, I think as humans, we all go through feelings of depression, right? Not necessarily clinical, like I'm talking about. We all experience that range of emotion, right? That spectrum of emotion. Okay. So again, if you're, I wanted to list a few of these out because these are common symptoms that can happen when we are going through a dark night of the soul. Okay. And also, again, let's talk about some triggers of the dark night of the soul, right? Like what causes the dark night of the soul? So like I talked about earlier, it could be many different scenarios. Okay. But let's dive into that a bit more specifically right now. So again, it could be life events, right? Major life events. It could be, as an example, end of a relationship. It could be the loss of a loved one. Okay, maybe you're a parent and you lost your child, as an example. I could imagine no greater loss than losing your child, right? Or losing a loved one in your family. Okay, these are different things that can, again, back you up into a corner and make you question a lot of different things, right? And just put you in a space where you're like, oh my goodness, right? Like it's a very difficult time in your life. It could be also, that you have lost your job, right? Maybe you've been working somewhere for 20 years and now you've got laid off. And now it's like, okay, well, who am I, right? Like, who am I now without my role? Like, I've been doing this for 20 years. What do I do? How do I provide for my family? Like, so many different questions can come up, right? And this is what I'm talking about. There are so many different things, so many different circumstances that can really back us up into a corner and trigger that dark night of the soul. And like I said earlier, right, just to kind of re-emphasize here, it could be a specific event or it could be an accumulation of things over many years. But let's talk about a hypothetical scenario. Okay, maybe you're someone who, you've been married for the past 20 years, okay, or 10, 20 years, an example, and then you go through a breakup, you go through a divorce with your partner, okay? That is something that can definitely cause a dark night of the soul for so many different reasons. But first and foremost, you have lost your partner, right? So it doesn't matter who's breaking up with who here, right? Obviously, I think after 20 years of marriage, I think it's safe to say that whoever breaks up with who, there's still a significant amount of loss, a significant amount of pain within that, okay? And basically, your identity for so long could have been intertwined with your partner, right? Because you've been in a relationship for so long that it's like, who am I without this person? Who am I without this relationship, right? So it challenges you. It challenges your sense of self. It challenges your identity. It challenges maybe even everything you thought you knew about relationships, right? And about love, all these different things. There's so many different things that can really be challenged, right? But again, it's like, it comes down to this question, who are you without this relationship? And also, you are losing shared dreams, right? Visions of the future that you had with that person that will no longer be relevant anymore because you're no longer with them, right? So there's a lot of things to kind of process as well when you're going through that, right? So this is what I'm saying. No wonder sometimes that can back us up into a corner and make us question a lot of different things, right? Because it's an extremely painful experience. And for a lot of us, right, that can be a trigger for a dark night of the soul. Now, let's give another perspective on a relationship, okay? Let's say that you have been with someone for 15 years, but it's extremely toxic, okay? It's been extremely, extremely toxic, but you're choosing to stay in the relationship, okay? You're staying in the relationship. It could be for different reasons, okay? You could be going through a dark night of the soul even when you're still in the relationship, right? Because you could be losing yourself. You could be losing yourself. You can be disconnecting from yourself. You could be questioning everything, okay? Questioning everything you once believed about that person, about yourself, questioning, again, beliefs about love and relationships. And, this shouldn't be normal, right? This shouldn't be a normal setting for a relationship, as an example, okay? So that can force you to go through a dark night of the soul. But then the other part of that is, if we're being honest, sometimes is a part of us wants to leave that relationship, okay, because we know that it's toxic and our body's telling us that that is toxic, and we know that the relationship isn't good for us, and we should be leaving. But there's another part of us that is staying there for different reasons, okay? There's a part of us that's staying there because it's familiar, and it's, as toxic as it is, right? It could be safe, okay? And sometimes what happens is our nervous system would rather have a familiar hell than an unfamiliar heaven, okay? So we stay somewhere that's kind of safe. We stay somewhere that's familiar because we're afraid of the unknown, because again, who are we without this person, right? Who are we without the relationship? Because again, you've built a sense of identity with this person for so long. And now the other side of this as well is not only do we lose someone and potentially a part of our identity, but there's another bigger thing at play here as well, is that we are forced to face ourselves, right? We are forced to face why we're staying into that toxic relationship. And this is where shadow work can come to play, because it's possible that through repression or suppression, there are parts of ourselves that we haven't faced, okay? There are parts of ourselves that if we brought to light, it would be very, very difficult to work through, right? So understanding why you've been staying in a place that's, so familiar yet so toxic, okay? There could be deeper wounding there that we haven't addressed, okay? There could be, again, fear of abandonment. There could be, as an example, fear of being alone. There could be so many different things that come out to play. So again, staying in that relationship out of fear, out of comfort, or out of dependency can be reflecting parts of your shadows that you haven't addressed, right? Such as fear of being alone and so many other different things, right? But this is what I'm talking about. Not only are we losing someone, a part of ourselves, but then we're forced to face parts of ourselves as well, which is extremely, extremely difficult. And just to share a bit about my own dark night of the soul, okay, so if I was to summarize my own experience and really what I learned was basically this, okay? I wanted other people to like me because I didn't like myself. At the end of it all, this is really what it was. I wanted other people to like me because I didn't like myself. And basically, external validation was the main thing around kind of like my identity, if you will, right? So I didn't know how to be happy with myself, so I searched for happiness in everything else, okay? I've been open about my body image issues before. I have a good relationship with my body now. I love the gym, and I always have, but now it's really from a healthy perspective, okay? But I thought, killing myself in the gym and getting that great physique would make people like me and accept me, right? And people would think it's kind of like cool, okay? And basically, I thought people would like me because of my body, right? So that's what I'm trying to say. And also things like getting a nice career, getting a nice job, getting a nice house, getting a nice car, all these different things, right? I thought those were the things that would make me happy, okay? And that's when it really shook my world, because when I realized, when I was sitting at home in my house and I was alone and I was realizing that everything I thought would make me whole didn't, that's when I started to question everything, right? And on top of that, my mom was going through cancer and all these different things. But when I really realized, like, everything I thought I knew that would make me happy didn't. That was like a core, right? Like, that's what I mean. It shook me to my core. It's like, okay, well, what do I do now, right? Like nothing is making me happy. What do I do now? And this is, again, where I had to kind of confront, and do shadow work a bit. It's like, okay, well, I am not enough, right? And I'm just kind of like summarizing this, but like, I am not enough. That belief, that is what I needed to bring to light in order to be able to heal myself and integrate that part of myself. But again, at the core of it all, I think, I just didn't like myself. I didn't like myself. And I think the person that I was trying to prove that I was enough to was myself, okay? And that didn't work. And that generally didn't work. And that's where, for me, there was a shift, okay? And I think for a lot of people, I think we get so sick of feeling a certain way that it's like we have no other choice but to change. We get so tired of feeling a certain way. It's like, okay, I need to do something else, right? And like, this is what happened for me. When I started realizing that everything I thought would make me happy didn't, this is where I started shedding. This is what I was talking about earlier. I was shedding those beliefs, shedding those, those things that I thought I was, right? And I was shedding all of these different things so that I can create space for what truly means something to me and what truly brings meaning to my life, okay? And that's when, at that point in time, I went through my soul searching journey, okay? And this took me a while. And this is what I'm saying. Even though you start seeing kind of light at the end of the tunnel, it doesn't mean you're out right away, but you don't need to have everything figured out as well, okay? But for me personally, as I was going through this, and then I started kind of my my soul searching journey, I started reading more books. I started really diving into myself, which again is still difficult, right? Because now you're starting to learn about yourself, but you also need to learn to unlearn the things that no longer serve you. Okay. Which again can be very difficult. So for me, like my dark night of the soul was again kind of like a chart, right? It was like up and down, up and down. But, as I was kind of, by the end of it, I realized like, wow, I've been through all of this, and now it's like I want to help other people going through a similar experience, right? Which is why I got into the podcast, which is why I got into coaching. I didn't have everything figured out at that point in time, but I just knew that meaning for me was to be of service to other people and help other people in the best way I can. And this is what my dark night of the soul allowed me to do, was to truly kind of, let my ego evolve, right? Let it do what it needed to do, shed those things that I didn't need anymore. And again, create space for the things that really were meant to be in my life. Okay. And again, this is how for me, I found meaning, right? In being of service to others and helping other people go through similar experiences, which again is why I started the coaching and the podcast. So what I'm trying to say is that you don't need to have everything figured out when you're going through the dark night of the soul. But let me tell you something, is that when you start seeing that light at the end of the tunnel, it's one of the greatest feelings that will ever come to you. I can't explain it other than that. And I was talking to a client today, and that's what they were saying. Literally, they were saying like, I'm seeing this light at the end of the tunnel, and it feels so good, right? And I'm like, yes, this is exactly what it's supposed to feel like, right? And this is what my experience for me allowed me to understand, is that it's not that I'm killing my ego, okay? It's not that I'm transcending my ego. It's that really I'm allowing myself to evolve. I'm allowing myself to create and solidify a better sense of identity, right? And a sense of identity that is truly aligning with my soul, okay? So that's what I'm saying. For me, it helped me develop a healthy ego. Okay. And I think this is what's so important about the whole process, and what's so transformative about this entire thing, is that you're kind of like building yourself again, right? And then you feel amazing at the end of it. So again, I just wanted to really highlight this, but if you are struggling and if you are going through this, just please understand, like I said earlier, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Okay. Now, I really want to kind of dive into, how do we work through this? Okay. How do we work through the dark night of the soul? So tip number one that I want to share with everyone is acceptance over resistance. Okay. Now I know that this is much easier said than done, right? I'm not trying to, discredit that at all, but it's simply giving ourselves permission to move through this, right? Allow ourselves to go through this experience, because, maybe as you're listening to this video now, you have an understanding of like, okay, this is what I'm going through, and it's completely normal. This is what I'm trying to say, okay? You're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. You're going through a transformative time in your life, and this is completely okay, and it's necessary, right? It's necessary. It's what I'm trying to also point here. It's kind of like this, the butterfly and the cocoon type of thing. You know what I'm trying to say, right? But again, it's a rebirth. It's allowing yourself to go through this experience so that you come out better on the other side, so that you come out on the other side with a good sense of self, right? And that your life has meaning again, and that you're feeling better, and that your quality of life is improved, okay? So this is what I mean. There will be resistance along the way, right? A dark night of the soul, you will have good days, bad days, all these different things. And with change comes resistance. But please, give yourself permission to move through it. I think something that's very important to highlight about acceptance, in my personal opinion, is that you don't have to like the situation or agree with what's going on, okay? Because in a lot of times when we're going through this dark night or this difficult circumstance, we're not yet in a state of acceptance, right? We can't just say, oh, well, I accept this. No, it doesn't happen that way. I think for me personally, acceptance, right, first and foremost begins with allowing yourself to feel the full spectrum of what needs to be felt, and allowing yourself to go through the dark night of the soul, right? Allowing yourself to go through that experience. And I think as you do that, and you allow yourself to grieve and to go through all, the full spectrum of emotions, you will, as a byproduct, come to a place of acceptance later on, okay? But you don't need to be in that place of acceptance right now. I think, again, this will come later on. And I think that's very important to highlight, because I think sometimes, it takes a little bit of time before we're able to truly step into that state of acceptance. And it's not a process that we need to rush, because again, I think that it will be a byproduct as we go through the journey and as we go through our healing. Tip number two that I want to share is to try to reframe the experience. Now, what I mean by that is, as you've seen from this episode today, a big part of the dark night of the soul is what comes out of it, right? It's the kind of that version of you that comes out of that. It's the experience, it's the transformations, it's the lessons that you learn. So if you're going through a really difficult time right now, please understand that, like I said earlier, there is light at the end of the tunnel. There's a reward at the end of this, right? And the reward will be much greater than you can ever imagine, even if you don't see it at this point in time, okay? So please allow yourself to go through the pain. Don't run away from the pain, right? No spiritual bypassing is what I'm trying to say, okay? Don't just say like, oh, I'm going through it. It is what it is. Everything happens for a reason. And then try to brush things off. No. Allow yourself to go through the pain, the resistance, all these different things. And one thing I do ask you is, please, if you have old patterns of addiction, try not to return to those, right? The dark night is also urging you to look at those patterns, because those patterns of addiction, okay, sometimes it could be, addiction, sex, porn, all these different things, right? Those are things we use sometimes as coping mechanisms when we've hit rock bottom, because we don't know what else to do with our lives, as an example. We don't know how to change. We don't know how to move forward. And that could be a way that we deal with stuff, okay? But again, the dark night is urging you to look at those patterns, because those patterns will be things that you shed that you will not be bringing forward in your new chapter, okay? So tip number 2 is, again, it's to really try to reframe the experience as, what am I learning from this, right? What is this teaching me? Tip number 3 is back to basics, okay? What I mean by this is sometimes when we're going through a dark night of the soul, if we kind of reflect back on earlier what we talked about in terms of the emotions and what we're feeling, right? That disconnect, that lonely, that isolation, all these different things, right? Sometimes if we're feeling low energy, low motivation, we don't really go back to the basics and take care of ourselves, okay? So this is what I'm saying. If we're going through this phase, it's very important that our basic needs are met. So how much sleep are you getting? Can you focus on getting more sleep? Have you been eating, right? Like, have you been eating nutritious meals, or are you just skipping meals all day, right? Try to get some food in you. Also, when's the last time you've moved your body, right? I think, like, especially when you're going through a dark night of the soul, grounding yourself, and not just like grounding yourself in terms of like, walking outside barefoot in nature, that's a beautiful thing, but like actually grounding yourself in your body. So going to the gym, right? Like going to the gym, exercising, going for walks, yoga, whatever it may be, but grounding yourself in your body as well. Kind of like that embodiment is what I'm trying to say. These are all crucial aspects, and probably the most important thing that I've shared today, honestly, as you are going through this dark night of the soul, right? Because during this difficult time, you need the odds stacked in your favor, as an example, right? And these are basic things that you can do to help yourself feel better and go through this transition and go through this experience, right? So tip number 3 is really back to basics. Tip number 4 is to seek connection and seek support, okay? This is so important, because I think one of the common symptoms of a dark night of the soul is isolation, right? Where we push everything away, we push everyone else out, and we're just kind of there, right? We're just kind of existing, and we're just trying to make sense of it all, and we're just trying to go through it and understand what's going on and all these different things. And of course, sometimes we don't mean to do this, but we do this, right? We do this and we isolate ourselves. And again, this is why I'm saying, you don't have to go through this alone. You do not have to go through this experience alone. And it's much better when you have someone to guide you, or even just someone to talk to you, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a coach or a therapist. Obviously, those would be great people to help you through this, but also it could be a friend that you're talking to, or a family member, okay? It could even be immersing yourself in a few good books, right? Books that can really help you go through the process of the dark night of the soul. There are so many out there that you could read on the dark night of the soul, or just what you're going through, right? Like I've talked about in other episodes, I truly believe that there's a book out there for anything that you are going through, right? And there are many different resources out there to really help us going through that. So it's not only seeking support, but also seeking different modalities that can help you through this difficult time, okay? But again, please understand that you are going to go through it, right? At your own pace. And kind of just a side tangent as well. One thing that I've kind of noticed is like, how do I accelerate my progress in the dark night of the soul, right? Like, how do I accelerate this? And in my personal opinion, I don't think it's a time that needs to be accelerated, right? I think it's a time that you're moving at your own pace, and that you are learning and integrating the lessons as you're learning, right? So I feel like if you're trying to accelerate, right, and trying to rush through the process, I think that could be kind of like a form of spiritual bypassing, like we were talking about earlier. So for me, it's about learning what needs to be learned in that lesson, right? If it takes 2 months, it takes 2 months. If it takes 6 months, it takes 6 months. And that is completely okay. And last but not least, the final tip that I want to share in today's video is to have self-compassion and to approach this process with a sense of curiosity. Okay. I think for me, those are the two things in life that can never miss, right? I know that they are extremely hard to kind of adopt into a scenario that can be so difficult, but please have self-compassion for yourself. Okay. You are going through something that's extremely difficult, and that is completely okay. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken, right? And sometimes it feels that way when we're shedding these old beliefs, we're shedding these old layers that no longer serve us, okay? And that's the other thing as well. When we're shedding, we're peeling back layers, right? And sometimes peeling back layers isn't necessarily only about discovering who you are, but who you were always meant to be, okay? So this is why I'm saying I think having self-compassion and approaching this whole process with a sense of curiosity, okay, and really allowing yourself to immerse yourself in the experience and be like, okay, let's be curious about this. And kind of like I talked about earlier, reframing this into an experience of like, what is this trying to teach me, okay? And just allowing yourself to join the dance, kind of like Alan Watts would say. But again, self-compassion and curiosity through this whole process. If you're dealing with parts of yourself that have been suppressed or repressed for a long time, there's no need to shame yourself for that, right? There are things that you're going to learn along this journey that will be difficult to face. But again, if you can approach that with a sense of curiosity, like in my example, right? Like, I'm not enough. Okay. Obviously, there's a lot of shame and guilt and fear and anger tied to those things. But instead of, well, initially, anyways, I was obviously hard on myself. But then as I kind of approached this sense of self-compassion and curiosity, I dove into what is it that's making me feel not enough, right? Like, why do I feel not enough? Okay. This is what I mean by turning that into a curiosity, right? And turning that into a curious approach where we can learn more about ourselves and the experience and then integrate that so that we can lead a better, more meaningful life.